of prevention would have been successful. And there are many, many consequences of allowing those deficits to accumulate. There are also, that's the bad news, the good news is there are many positive consequences of doing a good job in the early childhood period. Kathy McCartney talked about some of them, the long-term, the Deming study showing long-term effects. Here's one more study that shows long-term effects, and it's a very interesting study because it made use of the fact that 24 or 5 years ago in Tennessee, kindergarten children were randomly assigned to kindergarten classrooms. It only happened once in history, as far as I know, that children were randomly assigned to classrooms. Kathy talked about the fact that in the United States there's enormous economic sorting. Kids with more money go to better schools. Kids whose parents are more interested in education negotiate to get them into the classrooms of the best teachers. But for once in history, 12,000 children were randomly assigned to kindergarten classrooms. That meant, in principle, all of those classrooms were identical. But of course, at the end of the year, all of those classrooms weren't identical. And in fact, the dots represent groups of children, groups of classrooms, actually, that scored anywhere from the 30th percentile to the 70th percentile on a test of school accomplishments, of school achievement. So you see an enormous range. The classrooms were all identical at the beginning of the year, and by the end of the year, they show vast differences in how well the children in those classrooms scored. We can assume this has something to do with the quality of the teaching and the quality of the curriculum implemented in those different classrooms. But the interesting finding that made the front page of the New York Times a couple of months ago was that those differences in kindergarten classroom quality predicted earnings 25 years later. So kids who started out right had better income, were presumably more likely to be employed, and earned more if employed. So these are very long-term consequences of good early childhood programs. So why this emphasis on language, socio-emotional development, and health? As I said, there's a long, long history of research that would justify these as three important motors in the early childhood period, producing academic differences. And language in particular, this is the one I love the most. There are two arguments to be made about the importance of focusing on language and the quality of the language environment as one aspect of early childhood programs. One is, as I said, these enormous social class differences in language achievements. The difference between children from poor families with low levels of education who might know 1,000 words when they go to school at 4, and children in much more advantaged families who might know 4,000 words or 5,000 words. And it's not just knowing words, of course. I mean, the words are a signal for knowing things, for being able to talk about nature and relationships and history and science and all kinds of things. They are an indication that children have more well-developed cognitive accomplishments. So what do I mean when I say we want to promote language skills? Well, vocabulary very importantly, but also the capacity to engage in conversation, and particularly for long-term literacy outcomes, the capacity to engage in extended discourse, to tell a story that actually makes sense, to give an explanation, to explain to someone else how to play a game. These extended discourse skills turn out to be even more important in explaining reading skills later on. How do you learn those extended discourse skills as a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old? Well, you learn them from engaging in conversations in which they are embedded. Many years ago, I did a study together with some colleagues, a longitudinal study of a group of low-income families in the United States. And one of the things we did was record and analyze dinner table conversations. In some of these dinner table conversations, there was never an extended conversation. I mean, people talked, of course, but they talked in ways that did not develop the conversation. You know, eat your peas. Don't knock over your milk. Stop kicking your brother. Important things to accomplish at the dinner table, but in other families, in addition to eat your peas and stop kicking your brother, there were conversations like, what did you do at school today? Oh, why did the teacher say that to you? Did you learn anything about fire hoses? Tell me more about it. So longer conversations that developed themes. And those were the families that produced children who did better in reading at school. If that isn't going on at home, clearly that has to be going on in early childhood classrooms. Part of the capacity to get those extended conversations going is that you respond to children, that they get to pick, the youngest children get to pick what they're talking about, that the topics that they select are elaborated and extended by adults, that adults ask authentic questions, not yes-no questions, but questions to which they actually want to hear the answers. And all of this, I should emphasize, occurs within a positive socio-emotional relationship, a positive affective relationship. So if you're looking for those things, if you're walking into an early childhood classroom and looking for evidence, Kathy McCartney talked about sensitivity to non-distress, which I'm calling here responsivity. But also, in addition to responsivity, these cognitive capacities, richness of vocabulary. Do the adults use a few hundred different words, or do they use a few thousand different words in talking to the children? Do they engage the children in extended discourses? Do they ask open questions? Do they demand lots of participation from the children? Because children learn by talking, not just by listening. And do they use reading aloud as a mechanism for doing this? Now, there have been a number of reviews in the North American literature of the predictors of good reading outcomes. What do 5-year-olds know who are going to go on to become good readers? And what do the 5-year-olds who are likely to have trouble learning to read not know? The best predictors are knowledge of letters, phonological awareness, understanding that words are made up of syllables and syllables are made up of consonants and vowels, vocabulary, oral comprehension of stories, motivation, interest, a positive affective attitude toward reading, and understanding what you can do with print, understanding why you would, what marks on a piece of paper might mean, that the difference between a list and a story, the difference between a dictionary and an encyclopedia, where's the author, where's the title, sort of understanding concepts of print. These are the 6 skills that recurrently predict good reading outcomes. And of those skills, I keep coming back to vocabulary because it is, in some sense, the biggest and the most important of them, the most powerful in predicting differences in outcomes. And because it is so vulnerable in families, for children of families living in poverty. So what specifically are these linguistically enriching experiences? Well, part of it is responsivity, part of it is elaborating what children say. But that's not enough, because the fact of the matter is that children do not know what topics of conversation to introduce into their interactions with adults. Adults can introduce topics that are much more challenging and much more expansive of cognitive capacity. So these topics that go beyond the experiences of children. This is a very important aspect of quality in early childhood classrooms. Are we always talking about what did you do yesterday and what goes on at home? Or do we sometimes talk about space travel, or tidal pools, or climbing mountains, or flying in airplanes. Experiences that these children, for the most part, don't have, but that are a way of introducing more language and richer ideas into their experience. And of course, I'm not talking about strict instructional context here. I'm talking about a playful atmosphere, but a playful atmosphere that is systematically and programmatically enriched with language, ideas, content, knowledge, not just responsive to young children. So this is one of the reasons why there's a very, very special role for book reading, for reading books aloud, because books often introduce those topics, those more distant and more unusual and sophisticated topics, in ways that it's hard for us to do if we're just interacting with children. And one of the best demonstrated effects, experimentally demonstrated effects in early childhood interactions is the effect of what is called dialogic reading on children's improvement in language skills. Dialogic reading is a procedure that was first designed, developed, and tested by a researcher named Russ Whitehurst, in which the goal is to read a book with a child or a group of children, asking questions so that children remain attentive and active participants, and in subsequent readings of the same book to, as the adult, reduce your own role and increase the role of the children. That the children, after the third reading or the fifth reading or the 10th reading, become the storytellers themselves, that they take ownership of actually knowing what's going on in this book, with much less support from the adult. So these book reading experiences are opportunities for children to practice extended discourses, for them to learn the more sophisticated words that appear in the book, and of course opportunities to point out letters and the sounds they make. And a little bit of attention to letters and sounds while book reading has also been shown by Laura Justice to be effective in supporting children's literacy development. So my basic point here is that there's a lot to learn if you're going to become a good reader. That's one of the reasons it's very important to start early. That's one of the reasons that research suggests that attention to literacy in the early childhood period is very important, but that the size of the problem is not equivalent across a lot of different domains relevant to literacy. There are 20-some letters. There are 30 to 40 phonemes, the sounds of language, and the relationship between the letters and the sounds is very important, but it's a very limited space because there are only 20, how many letters are there in Spanish? 26? No, 20. It depends whether, okay, it depends whether you're doing ch and eye and all of that. All right, 26 letters. I believe that people estimate in most dialects of Spanish that there are 36 phonemes. So there's some spelling rules to learn. But that's nothing compared to, how many vocabulary items are there in Spanish? 150,000 maybe? I don't know. It seems like every time I pick up a Spanish book, I find 200 new words I've never seen before. So there are at least 100,000 words that college students in Spanish-speaking college students know. That is a huge task, and that's why focusing on the richness of the language in these early childhood settings is so much more important than just focusing on letters and sounds. Okay. And so this is another picture of how researchers think about literacy development. That when you're good at it, all the way over there at the right-hand side, it's a tightly braided rope. But inside that tightly braided rope are represented strands that have to do with letter recognition and phonological awareness at the bottom, which of course all have to develop, with language comprehension, vocabulary, language structures at the top, and that as you become a good reader, both those strands get to be more and more developed, more and more tightly wound, and tightly wound together, so that you're not actively processing, you're automatically processing both language and print when reading as a skilled reader.